how unaffordable it is, even unattainable, to buy a home in Vancouver.
Here in one of Vancouver's most desirable neighborhoods, a renovated, move-in ready family home. Now the price tag slightly less than $4 million.
An increasing number of people in this country are giving up the dream of owning a home.
The federal government is again targeting Canada's housing crisis in its latest pre-budget announcement. Ottawa wants to work with municipalities to fast-track funding.
Lately, it feels like Canadian media is churning out content about the housing crisis, like CNN talking about OJ in the early 90s or Fox News talking about the woke mind virus today. Why? Because the housing crisis keeps getting worse. And the news stories never get old. Literally everyone has a stake in it. Everyone has to live somewhere, and lately it feels like nobody can afford to live anywhere. As the news content machine continues to churn, it reaches deeper and deeper into the economics of Canadian housing and the part that housing plays in the broader Canadian economy to produce some really good and popular media that's dangerously close to getting it. But at the same time, that media is still too sensitive to their entire audience to really get down to the core of the problem.
We say we want house prices to fall, but I don't know if we actually do. I mean, we protest, we wave signs, we yell slogans, we get angry.
That was the CBC's Andrew Chang, one of the Canadians lucky enough to be rich enough to own a home. Chang is wrestling with the cognitive dissonance sometimes experienced by homeowners when they realize that the value of the equity in their home going up is the same thing as an increase in the overall cost of housing, including their overall cost of housing in the long run. That didn't occur to them when they bought the house. Just the opposite. Wage earners buy instead of rent so that their housing payments contribute to an asset, instead of just becoming their landlord's income. Now, I don't know about you guys, but every time I go to a social event and the topic of housing comes up, which happens all the time, there's always at least one loudmouth in the room who has to tell everybody why it got this way and what we could do to change it. Everyone has solutions to solving the problem. But to really solve it, it takes an ability to recognize who's winning here, the consequences this economic paradigm is creating, and a willingness on the part of politicians to make some hard decisions that are going to piss some people off. Let's dive in. I want to start with an example here, one where a tenant named Tony rents a house and pays $3,100 a month in rent. Of course, renting has problems. Tony can have a lazy landlord who doesn't fix things. The price of his rent can go up every year. And Tony can't get too comfortable because he could wake up one morning to an email telling him he has 60 days to pack up his belongings and leave. So perhaps it makes more sense to be a homeowner. Of course, Tony has that little problem of coming up with a $160,000 down payment to buy a similar house. But let's assume he can come up with that down payment. Now he gets a 4% mortgage to cover the rest of an $800,000 home. 4%, of course, is lower than today's current rates, but I digress. Let's just use 4%. Now, Tony can put his $3,100 in housing costs towards a mortgage. That way, he's building up equity in his home instead of the payment being just a pure cost. But those payments don't all build equity. At 4%, that mortgage would be incurring around $2,100 per month in interest, at least at the start. In other words, instead of wasting money on rent, Tony is now wasting money by paying for the right to borrow money. But at least in this case, only a portion of that $3,100 is being quote-unquote wasted. So if Tony makes $3,100 payments every month, he's staying ahead of the interest and is in line to pay off the mortgage in 30 years. A 30-year payment commitment on 10 times someone's annual income sounds crazy, but everyone does it. At least everyone who can afford the down payment, because everyone needs a place to live. Housing is a necessity, so as an asset, that makes it the closest thing there is to a sure thing. So in the first 15 years, most of Tony's housing payments are going to the bank in the form of interest. In fact, after 15 years, Tony will have contributed $237,000 to his home equity and paid $320,000 to the bank in interest. But hey, that's housing. That's finance. That $37,000 per year is going to be spent on housing one way or another. So the mortgage is a way for the homeowner to basically keep 60% of their housing payments over 30 years. That's a pretty great deal for Canada's banks because it's designed to be. So let's touch on the CMHC. The Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation is a crown corporation that was created by the National Housing Act to protect the availability of adequate funding for housing at a low cost and generally contribute to the well-being of the housing sector in the national economy. The CMHC is basically a big government-backed insurance company that charges the banks a premium to insure the risks on the mortgages they write. In 2022, the CMHC had about $471 billion of exposure to Canadian mortgages being insured on its balance sheet. Between all of its insurance and underwritings, the CMHC is backing most of the mortgages in Canada one way or another. And at any given time, between 30% and 50% of the bank's assets are mortgages. And why wouldn't they be? The CMHC is practically begging the big banks to take the default risk off their hands and hand it over to the CMHC. For example, if the banks generate 4% on their mortgage portfolios, that's between $3 and $17 billion a year for each big bank. Even if the bank has to borrow the money they lend to the homeowner at 1% and pay another 1% to insure it, they're still making 2% on their investment risk-free. Let me repeat that. We're talking assets on the big bank's balance sheets of $300 to $400 billion generating risk-free profit because we've set up a system that strips the big banks of risk. The obvious question is, what happens if there is a major housing crash and the CMHC can't write a check big enough to insure all those defaults? Let's just say in such a catastrophic scenario, the Canadian government would likely need to intervene to ensure the CMHC could meet its obligations and maintain financial stability. Which begs the question of why the system even needs to exist, and if it's possible that the banks have been underwriting mortgages on houses at price levels that make no sense, because the banks know they're not on the hook if those mortgages go into default. Anyways, the system leaves plenty of room to work in a whole industry of mortgage brokers who make their money selling more mortgages to put on the bank's balance sheets. The CMHC's guarantees and insurance allows the mortgages in Canadian houses to be pooled and traded as securitized instruments. That gives the banks some liquidity and lets other players in finance, like insurance companies and pension funds, get in on the action. There are trillions of dollars and counting in housing finance. After all of these years of facilitating access to housing finance and protecting funding for housing at a low cost, the housing sector represents an enormous chunk of the Canadian economy. 3 of Canada's top 10 companies by market cap and 4 of the top 10 by earnings are banks. The number 1 company in the country by earnings is Brookfield, which is basically a complicated real estate company. As a side note, I want to do a video on them in the future and their investment in Sagan, just so we can understand how important their mortgage insurance wing is to their whole operation. Managing money is all about making money make more money. For example, the $160,000 that our homeowner Tony used for a down payment had to go somewhere. Putting it into his house was the first step in getting to keep 60% of his housing payments over 30 years. The equity side of real estate is almost certainly Canada's most popular investment. It sustains a small army of professional real estate companies, agents, management companies, and brokers. Canadian housing equity in aggregate has tripled since 2005, while some regions like Vancouver and Victoria have nearly quadrupled. And why wouldn't it? If our guy had another $160,000, he could buy another house and keep 60% of someone else's housing payments for 30 years. Why would he do anything else? And for the people who do manage to have $160,000 or even say $160 million, why would they do anything else? And eventually,
I pay a mortgage. I'm trying to build equity, and I'm not alone.
I remember being at a public meeting and somebody said, "Can you get the price of housing down by 10%? And I said, hands up if you'd like to see 10% of the equity in your home suddenly disappear overnight.
Deflating housing prices will create more problems than it will solve. And the first thing is, you have to realize, if you're a new buyer and you find out that the housing prices will be declining by 30% over the next year, what will you do? You won't buy. This notion that we want to reduce housing prices, let's get the prices down by 30%. Those who are asking for it, those who are pushing for it, because they say we'll be able to buy it, they will disappear at the very first sight of housing losing value.
For most Canadians, their home.
I've got some really bad news for these people about how markets work. Markets are volatile, but housing markets aren't the stock market. Investors expect property to keep its value because it does keep its value. It's always useful. Any usable house in any urban area has value to anyone who wants to sleep and live there. So you can't really blame politicians and media pundits for expecting housing to maintain its value. The idea behind the National Housing Act was that stable financing would keep the housing economy stable, so that Canadians would have places to live, work to contribute to the economy, raise families, build communities, keep the country growing. But as long as housing is the safest and most popular investment, home prices only ever really get stabilized upwards. Between the government mortgage insurance, the chartered banks, the mortgage brokers, and the real estate agents, there is hundreds of billions of dollars worth of financial infrastructure out there ready to help these equity investors refinance and let their investments ride. Today, we have less than 10% of Canadian income earners who can afford the monthly payments on your average mortgage, and quite frankly, that math is probably generous. This is our economy now. The capital is camped out in housing and finance, and that's where the bulk of the economic activity is being generated. So when the economy needs investment in clean tech or auto manufacturing or aerospace, private capital just isn't interested. And why would it be? There's plenty of low risk return available in housing and finance. And it doesn't end there. The government ends up having to back most major investments in the industries that create the earned income that fuels the economy enough to keep the housing market and associated industries going, which of course, as we've explained, is also backed by the government. With a thoroughly financialized housing market embedded so deeply into our economy, it's no wonder housing is so expensive. All available housing stock is being squeezed for every dollar it can pay to the banks and the landlords, who then borrow more money from the banks to invest in more housing. The solution to the cycle being prescribed by the country's housing proponents in both government and industry is to build more housing units. But if there's capital that wants to invest in new housing units, it certainly isn't coming from the 1.6 trillion or so of capital invested in the housing that already exists. New builds are much harder to finance, and they don't generate income streams until they're later sold at a profit, well, hopefully. So why would capital invested in housing go anywhere else? Especially somewhere else that's further up the risk curve. The CMHC is an important catalyst in all of this, and they do invest a great deal of money into new housing. One of their many programs, the Rental Housing Construction Initiative, has committed $25 billion in financing to create rental housing that's partially tied to affordability standards. The $25 billion gets loaned to developers at a cut rate until the housing is ready to move into and eligible for a regular mortgage, because at that point, it's then suitable to become someone else's income asset. New rental housing might bring the cost of housing down for a little while, but that stock is bound to fill up, because it's a commodified asset that needs to generate cash for some landlord who owes the bank, who owes the government, all of whom have an obligation to get the most out of their asset. Housing can't be affordable and a cash generating financial asset. Collectively, we're just beginning to come to terms with that.
So just think about it. From your point of view, when you rent, you're not so much invested in the value of your home. Your tenancy is more contractual, kind of like leasing a car. And there are entire national housing markets that work this way. In Germany, for example, renters outnumber homeowners. There, it's largely a cultural thing. After the Second World War, around 20% of West Germany's housing stock was destroyed. There were also refugees coming from the East. So the government had a real crisis on its hands. How do we house millions of people who are suddenly homeless? Well, it got building. Simple rental properties, heavily subsidized. Rent controls, housing affordability, social welfare, they all became really big priorities. And because rents stayed affordable for so long, renting just became how you live.
Chang is talking about solving this problem with a volume of rental units that are so controlled and so cheap that they take the demand edge off of the housing market and curb the equity appreciation. That's one way to do it, and it's worked in other places, including Germany, and it could work here. But as long as that housing stock is being used by someone as a financial asset, we're going to end up right back where we started. And the Liberal government could do that right now. They could announce a massive housing project to get into the landlording business and build massive amounts of 3-bedroom units across the country to give people affordable places to live and help drive down housing prices. Another way to do it would be to make homes just one per customer. People can own the house they live in, but that's all. No more landlording. The tenants could then all buy homes and build equity with the money that they used to be feeding to their landlords. There would be more home buyers, and that would keep the real estate people and the mortgage brokers busy, but considerably less capital would be tied up in the housing market. And then that capital would be free to go and do something a bit more useful than muscling people out of money so that they can afford to live indoors.